This is Somewhere in the Skies with Ryan Sprague.
Hi, guys. Ryan Sprague here from Somewhere in the Skies, and we have so much to cover tonight with our guest. You know him very well in the UFO field. In fact, he was the first guest on Somewhere in the Skies, and it's just taken off from there. So I will be forever grateful to him for that. Let's bring him in. He's going to be answering your listener questions tonight. This is sort of a Ask Me Anything of our guest, historian and researcher, Richard Dolan. Rich.
Oh, it's so nice to be back here. I'm very happy to be here with you again. What a pleasure.
It has been a crazy few years since you and I last spoke about UFOs. A lot has happened, and I kind of want to cover a lot of that with you tonight, but I want to go as current as possible. It's the only thing being talked about right now in the news cycle, and that's the balloon. And I don't know your thoughts on all of this, but I would love to get your perspective about what's going on, because it does sort of tie in to a lot of what's going on in the UFO world now and AARO and all of that stuff. So I'm just going to flat out ask the question. What do you make of this whole China spy balloon thing? Where do you think it's heading? And does this have absolutely anything to do with the UFO and government conversation going on right now?
Well, answer your last question first. I'm going to think no. I don't think this is a strictly speaking UFO-related matter. However, it is interesting, and it's important when you look at the contemporary geopolitical realignment that's happening in the world right now. What we're seeing, obviously, is that the United States is essentially sort of fumbled away its geopolitical dominance over the world. I mean, it was inevitable that would happen, but I certainly think that things have happened in the last year and more that have accelerated that. So with China, so China said that this balloon was for commercial purposes only. I don't know who really believes that at all. In fact, this morning, I believe the U.S. has made the claim that they have proof or what have you, that this is an espionage balloon. Now, having said, I will never, ever take anything the United States says as its word. The U.S. does not have good record of honesty, but it's probably true. I would say this is probably a spy balloon. It's not an unusual thing that China would do that. The real question is is there significance to this? I mean, first of all, the U.S. is acting like it's shocked and offended that its sovereignty has been invaded by a spy balloon, when in fact the United States is, of all nations, the number one that violates the sovereignty of other countries. The U.S. has always done that, and the U.S. will always do that as long as it has the capability. So, and that includes all kinds of espionage, that includes all kinds of, color revolution shenanigans and the like. I mean, this is what the U.S. does better than anyone else in the world. China can't compete with that in the least. So I love how, the U.S. is all offended about this. The real problem is that I think with China, they're still fuming. They're furious over the visit of a few months ago by Nancy Pelosi when she was, leader of the House. She makes that trip to Taiwan, which really infuriated the Chinese. I don't think Americans and people in the West appreciated just how angry the Chinese were. And a lot of Americans are like, well, screw you, China. You don't own Taiwan. Who do you think you are? But in China's position, they've been very clear about this, that Taiwan is part of China. And so this was a direct offense, particularly since Pelosi was the same member of the same party as the U.S. President Biden. So it was taken as very much kind of an official thing. So the Chinese, I think, were angry about that. I think maybe it made them a little more willing to just piss off the Americans on this. And then I think what sealed the deal in my mind about this is the Chinese, in the aftermath of this, after the U.S. shot down the balloon with an F-22, no less. Amazing. The Chinese said, well, the next time a U.S. aircraft comes near Chinese airspace, maybe we'll do something. So that was a definite ratcheting up. of hostilities between U.S. and China. And this is very unlike China, by the way. And if you look at Chinese history, China is not a truly expansion, like a geographically expansionist power. It really never has been. China has an empire within China. That's it. They've got Tibet. Okay, you can argue about that. But China doesn't go around the world trying to switch out governments and conquer them. They don't have wars. China's last real war was in 1979 against the Vietnamese, and they didn't do well, by the way. So China is not a militaristic power in the sense that the United States is. But I think China is now feeling their oats. They are definitely quite powerful now. Everyone knows it. They've got the world's strongest or second strongest economy. And they have a military that is a very substantial military now. So I think China is, I think it's I would say their fury over the recent Taiwan thing. And they are now coming up with reasons to ratchet. And also the other reason is that who's afraid of the United States anymore? Let's get real. The United States has shown that U.S. funded and NATO trained troops, for example, the Ukrainians, are not a match for the Russians. And that's just the reality. Ukraine had the strongest military in all of Europe, other than Russia itself. People don't realize Ukraine was extremely well trained up to NATO standards. They're not NATO officially, but they were. There's no question that the Ukrainian military was maybe the only other Europe military in NATO that was as good as be Turkey's. But Ukraine's was very well trained, and they have been ground into a fine paste by the Russians. So that's kind of a reflection, I think, of the actual weakness of U.S. military, Western doctrine, strategy, and even equipment. All the West has been used to fighting for the last 20 years are wars in the desert against jihadists armed with AK-47s. They're not used to fighting actual peer-level militaries. And when you get one such as the Russians are, I think there's no question the U.S. would never, ever win a ground war against Russia. And I think the Chinese have now seen this. I think the rest of the world is seeing this. And maybe they're not so afraid of the Americans anymore.
It does seem to be performative, in if I can use that word. It seems to be a game. And we're now learning that there's more balloons that have been spotted that the U.S. has known about for a while. And that kind of plays into, I guess, the second half of that question. We have this new office, AARO, that's supposed to be in, a resolution office, figure out what these things are and if they're a threat. And even in this recent Pentagon report, we learned the term balloon-like entities. And that could not be more telling than what we're seeing play out right now. So what, if anything, does this have to do, Rich, with UFOs? Anything?
What's striking about the conversation coming out of the military on UFOs, or UAP now, as they like to say, is how utterly tepid it is, and how they still have this pretense of saying things like, well, we're trying to understand what this is. We're looking into it. And when we find something out, we'll let you people know. Like, what are you talking about? You've been dealing with this in highly dramatic, shockingly dramatic ways for 80 years minimum. We know this. We have a detailed historical record of it. We have a very good case for crash retrievals of UFOs on multiple occasions within the U.S. and beyond the U.S. And I was just reviewing it was an old classic case from 1957 in Brazil, the Ubatuba case, where an object was seen by beachgoers at the Brazilian Atlantic coast coming in, looking like it was going to crash. It's shooting straight up and then exploding into hundreds of shards and pieces, looking like fireworks. In the aftermath of that, the United States, the U.S. military came in. I think it was like 2 or 3 days later. The U.S. has been on top of this situation since the beginning. And so what we have from the Pentagon are these this pretense, this game of pretend that they like to play, which is, okay, well, yeah, we're looking into this, and maybe there is something there. This is kind of where we were in the 1950s. So that, I guess what I'm saying is never, ever expect honesty or good faith from the United States government on anything having to do with the matter of UFOs. You may, from time to time, get a member of Congress who gets worked up and interested about this. That can happen. That is certainly possible. But that's a whole bit different from the institutional apparatus of the military, the national security state, to do anything honest about this subject in terms of actually reporting to the public. They're never going to do it. They'll never do this honestly. I don't think you should ever expect anything out of them unless they are pushed to the wall by either a leak or some kind of information that comes out that's unexpected, that forces a statement from them, in which case the pattern has always been that they will give as absolutely little as they have to before they can just run away from the subject. And that's what, even in the last 5 years, we've seen this. We may want to get into this if you want, but I am not one of these people who believes that the two original New York Times stories were an initiated deep state operation. I think that was a reflective reaction to something that was going to come out. You had TTSA back in October of 2017 making their announcement that they're an organization. You had Elizondo and Mellon in the background getting the 3 of the videos declassified. That was a real score, by the way. They had friends and they had enemies within the Pentagon, and they used their friends to get that declassified. My point is that the New York Times article, in my view, was something that Leslie Kean and Ralph Blumenthal lobbied to get done. That is true. But I think the New York Times leadership decided, you know what, this story is going to come out. Why don't we be the ones who break it? We'll get out in front of it. And I think that's what happened. And I think what you've seen since then is the deep state, or the national security state, very effectively responding to this, and slowly but surely taking control over the narrative once again, as they are used to doing. So they've given up a little bit. They've now, more than 5 years ago, they would play this other game of pretend, like there's no UFOs. We don't notice anything. There's nothing. Remember, 10 years ago, Steve Bassett did his, what the hell was that called? A disclosure petition to the Obama White House back then.
Right. Yeah.
And the answer that he got was a classic lie right out of the Obama White House, which is that we've seen no evidence whatsoever of any UFOs that are anything unusual. When at the same time they had the ATIP office that was running at that very time that was investigating UFOs, but they lie. They lie at every opportunity they can, and when that lie no longer is tenable, they come to a different position. And I think that's all that we're seeing. So with AARO, there are people who say, well, there's witness protection measures that are inside there, which is true. There are these measures that are in place. So will that make a difference? We'll have to wait and see. It's possible. It's also possible that this will be a whole lot of smoke and mirrors. So I'm not at a point where I will ever trust these government bureaucracies until they actually show otherwise, and they haven't yet. So, think of all of the so-called reports that we've had up until now in the last couple of years. First, it was 144 UAP sightings. Then last year it was, we were up to over 400. Have we gotten any details about any single one of them? No.
Not a single case.
Not one. Yeah. Not one. So this is how they operate. And they obviously know that they have sufficient control and cooperation with the mainstream media. They're not getting pushed on this. They're not getting pressured. No one in Congress is really pushing back. Here and there, a couple of Congress members are, pushing just mildly, but nothing significant. So I don't expect anything out of AARO. I'd love to be wrong. So let us wait and see. But so far, they are unfortunately fulfilling my prophecies.
You and me both. I know. It's been an interesting journey since that article came out. I don't know what to make of any of it, but you're right. We'll have to wait and see. Well, that kind of brings us up to current day. The other current day thing I wanted to touch on before I move to our amazing listener questions that I had to narrow down profusely is UFOs for the 21st Century Mind, the updated, expanded edition of the book.
Over
70 new pages, right? Let us know what's new in it. What have you learned since the original came out, and what can people expect in the updated version, if you don't mind?
Oh yeah, thanks for asking. That was a nice surprise. It's as you just said, it's about 70 new pages that the original did not have. Nearly all of that is to update the last decade or so of UFO history. So I wrote a very, very long chapter. It's actually the longest chapter of the book now, I believe, covering the entire UFO subject from 2013 through the very end of 2022. So just a month and a half ago. So it takes the story fully, I think, very well up to date, to be honest. It covered, where the UFO field was in 2013, 2014, just before things really started to change a bit in the public realm. I had a lot to say about the events of 2017 and the coverage that transformed the public debate on UFOs, and covered a lot of that in a lot of detail, actually, the politics of that and so forth. Talked about some interesting recent UFO sightings in the last decade, that most of which are really not well known, but are interesting. And I wanted to just talk about, how is the phenomenon continuing today? And then I did a kind of revised look at our trajectory as a society and where I think we're headed, as opposed to a decade ago when I wrote the first edition of that book. So one of the main things that I have argued, I put this actually in my other recent book, The Alien Agendas. I firmly believe we are in the middle of a global revolution that's going on right now. And that has an effect on the UFO subject. By global revolution, I simply mean a centrally organized, coordinated, international revolution, mostly against the people, against traditional rights that we've had. Do I need to explain this anymore? Basically, a 24/7 panopticon surveillance state is one aspect of it. And there's a lot of other aspects going on there. I think we're looking at the advent of very strong AI. That is a component of it. But what we're seeing is an intentional reorganization of human society in a very different way, essentially turning us into kind of a big technological anthill. And so that being the case, massive global changes have to happen to the social structure, to the intellectual, to our psychology, to our politics, to our rights. And you see this happening. COVID was a very perfect opportunity for them to do that. But they'll take any opportunity they can. The current war in Ukraine and Russia, I think, will offer its own opportunities to further this revolution. And the reason that I'm bringing it up here, I talk about it in the revised UFOs of the 21st Century Mind, but it's important because when you are moving into a very potentially dark, quasi-totalitarian global society, you have to ask yourself, how does that affect the UFO conversation? And I think it does have an effect on the UFO conversation. So what I think we're seeing is in the public establishment domain, it is now okay to ask, the basic tepid questions. So like, is there something out there? Maybe there is something out there. Let's look into it. That level, that's okay. That's okay. What's not okay is to go over the red line into conspiracy accusations and cover-up accusations. And so into a deep analysis. And the reason that that's not permitted, and you can see that this is still all these years now into this new era. We're in 2023. And we are still it is impossible to have an open discussion on the structure of the UFO cover-up and conspiracy, international conspiracy of silence. And the reason for that is that because we are now in an era in which you and I are not supposed to believe in conspiracy theories. We all know this. What is a bigger conspiracy theory, frankly, than the UFO cover-up, I ask you? Probably not anything, or it's right up there. So could you imagine President Joe Biden saying, well, yeah, the UFO thing, that's real, but don't believe in the other conspiracy theories. Even though we lied to you on this like massive one, yeah, that's kind of true, but don't believe in the others. They cannot do that. It's absolutely not tenable. So the UFO conspiracy angle must be suppressed at all costs. And you can see this is continuing what's happening. There's been some tension along those lines. If you go back to 2020, one of the New York Times articles that Leslie and Ralph put out was in July of 2020. They came this close to in that one admission they had by Dr. Eric Davis, very close to admitting that there were actual crash retrievals of UFOs, but they didn't step over the line. And you've noticed nobody has approached that line since, not within the establishment culture anyway. So that's, I think, is a red line. And I think the global revolution that we are going through is in the process of attempting to transform human society at a very fundamental level into one of very tight control. We're moving into an era of great, great control. So that it's going to be the real interesting thing to see from moving here forward is how will that tension resolve itself? Will the hammer come down fully? Will the lid come down fully and be screwed down so that there will never be a genuine conversation about the UFO conspiracy? Or will there be a breakthrough somehow? That is really the question we need to be looking at, because all signs point to the attempts by the international security apparatus to keep this subject safe and defanged for as long as humanly possible. If they can keep it going for another 5 years, they'll do that. If they can keep it going for 50 years, for 100 years or more, they will do that as well. They will keep this, they will keep the fundamental truths away from the public for as long as absolutely possible. That's what I believe.
Interesting. Well, I look forward to reading the updated edition to learn more about that for sure, Rich. Thank you. Well, let's move to these listener questions because we've got a lot to cover. Sort of every aspect of ufology, I tried to condense into these questions for you. So this should be pretty fun. Our first few questions come from our patrons who get priority to ask you questions. And then you are kind enough to stick around over on Patreon to answer a few more of their questions. So I appreciate you doing that too. But our first one here comes from Metal Matt on Patreon and Anthony, actually, on Twitter. They had a very similar question. What do you think about the details of the Nimitz case? And what do you think the Tic Tacs may have been? I mean, still to this day, we're wondering. Do you have any personal thoughts or observations of what these objects might have been, this case that we've kind of held up to such high esteem for the past 5 years or so?
Yes. Yeah, I do. So the first thing is to recognize the year in which this event occurred. So it was November of 2004. So let's just do a little bit of checking off the list and checking off who could be a suspect and who could not. So let's look at international powers first. Russia and China come to mind. The U.S. and Russia and the U.S. and China are essentially enemies. We're not even adversaries anymore. But in 2004, this was not the case. In 2004, Russia was trying actively to join NATO. This is kind of a forgotten thing, and the U.S. basically made sure that did not happen. But Russia, under Putin at that time, was very much trying to work with the West on a whole range of issues. And furthermore, Russia's military was probably at the lowest point it had ever been around that time. They're much, much more potent now, but not in 2004. So I think it's absolutely out of the question that Russia would have had anything to do with that. And I would say the same regarding China. China in 2004 was a growing power. They were growing economically. They were working on their military. But to say that they had tic-tac UFO technology, I think would be absurd. And there's absolutely nothing to support that. So I would leave out foreign adversaries, and there's no other nation that you could really imagine that would possibly have done that. So then you ask about U.S. black budget capabilities, and this is something that people have wondered. I wonder sometimes. I don't think so. I don't believe that this is part of like a breakaway civilization or advanced black budget for a few reasons. One, that, as we know the details of this story, you have Kevin Day, who ran radar over at the USS Princeton, as part of the Nimitz battle group there, had been tracking these UFOs in the atmosphere for several weeks, multiple ones, not just one object. There's large numbers of them. They were hanging around, if we could say, in the area where the U.S. was conducting war exercises in the Pacific. So it seems to have been a kind of observational thing, kind of a monitoring thing. I mean, we're guessing here, but there was certainly a lot of activity. The other thing that you want to keep in mind is that when Fravor's team were vectored in to examine this unknown object that, now we're on November 14th, Kevin Day sees them again. He's like, they're out there. We've got a couple of FA-18 Super Hornets. Let's see if we can vector them in. So the two aircraft get there, and they didn't just see one object above the water, the Tic Tac UFO. There was a larger object below the water, according to the accounts that have come to us. So we're talking an explicit USO that was there, as well as this other object. So if we're talking very advanced black budget, this is beyond anything that I've even had any reason to think that we can do in terms of USO technology and the like. And then, the entire confrontational attitude that happened, that ensued, it just doesn't look like a black budget operation to me, because frankly, the capabilities of the Tic Tac UFO are absolutely in line with capabilities that the U.S. military has been recording explicitly since the 1940s. The speed with which the Tic Tac departed, I estimate to be in the neighborhood of 10,000 miles per hour, maybe more. But guess what? We have documents from the 1940s that are military documents that discuss the tracking of these objects at comparable speeds way back then, 70 to almost 80 years ago. So in other words, the Tic Tac encounter is part of a long-standing pattern of encounters that the United States military has had with these objects. And let's remember, not just the United States military, but militaries of other nations, the old Soviet Union, and all of the Western allies you can think of have had these types of encounters with objects of comparable performance capability. So what does that leave us? That leaves me thinking we are dealing with a technology that does not come from our civilization. That's what I believe. I think the Tic Tac UFO was not made by us, whether American, Russian, Chinese, or any other civilization that we know of on Earth, and was, in fact, is the product of a civilization that is more advanced and that presumably is not from here. So that's what I think.
Okay, thank you. Well, you did mention the term breakaway civilization, which is basically a term that you coined in your early research and work. And Mark on Patreon asks, you used to have quite a strong belief about breakaway civilization. Is it something you still believe in, or have you altered your thinking on that subject at all?
That's a great question. No, I still believe that there is something along these lines. Maybe what's altered is, or maybe what's become a little more, where I become a little more cautious is in drawing conclusions as to just how advanced I think it is. So what I think is that, yes, there is very deeply classified science, a lot of which has to do with the recovery of these crashed or downed or landed UFOs. And what that means is, the possession of something so utterly advanced, in the opinion of the people controlling the secret, is of such paramount secrecy that there is just no way this can be allowed to seep out. And so you have essentially a secret scientific effort going on to understand this. And so a secret science can lead to secret breakthroughs of understanding, which themselves may have to be kept secret unless you can find a safe way to kind of segue them into the public. So it's very easy to lead to very highly advanced capabilities within the classified world, and that's really the foundation of what I call a breakaway civilization. So I still think that is true. The thing that I will be a little more careful about are relating to some of the more exotic capabilities that might exist. So when we talk about portals, we talk about time travel, we talk about, zipping across the galaxy instantly and this type of thing. I've heard people making these types of claims, and I'm a bit dubious about them. Particularly, look, over the last 5 years and beyond that, there are a number of people making some irresponsible and fraudulent, I would say, claims that were related to a breakaway civilization. And I think it did a lot of damage to the concept itself, frankly. When you have people talking about time traveling and this type of thing, fighting aliens on Mars and the like, I think did serious damage to our field for a few years. Fortunately, I think we've kind of gotten over that little crazy party. So I feel like, no, it's a legitimate concept. I absolutely think that there is something along these lines. The real question is, how far does it go? How far does it go? But yes, I think that there is something along these lines. I will continue to believe that.
Okay. Well, in terms of concepts, when you and Bryce Apel co-authored your book, 80 After Disclosure, really, it's crazy to think of where we were then and where we are now. And and this is one of our most popular questions. Amy on Patreon and Brandon through Facebook asked, has your concept or idea of what disclosure may look like changed since the publishing of the original book? And if so, how?
That's a good question. Well, when we wrote that book, so Bryce and I love Bryce. I respect him tremendously, but our attitudes are a little different. They were different then, and I suspect that they're probably a little bit different today, which is fine. We all have our perspective. So among the two of us, I would say he was always a bit more of an optimist than I was. I think that's fair to say. I think he would agree with that. That doesn't mean that I was a total pessimist about disclosure. We wrote that book in the year 2010. 2010. Wow. So that's 12, 13 years ago, just about. That was before the big tech revolution against freedom of expression became obvious. When we believed, when it was true, that there was this alternate media, as it were, that could be a kind of a lever against the legacy media. At least this is how I saw it. So my reasoning at the time was, we're in an era where WikiLeaks was still going. National governments had not really brought the hammer down against WikiLeaks the way they did shortly after that. And that we were in an era where the flow of information, to me, seemed like it was going in one direction, and that at a certain point, there would be an inevitable breakthrough in terms of a leak, an unexpected disclosure, and the like. So there are a couple of things that are different between then and now, and one, I would say, miscalculation on my part. So the things that are different are, we've had a definite digital revolution since then. We've seen, remember in Star Wars, the Empire Strikes Back? Well, the Empire has struck back since that time and has gone a long, long way toward consolidating its control over big tech and over populations in general. So that's one thing. And so that took away the whole leverage that I think was available on social media, like YouTube, for example, or Facebook. My attitude was, if something big happens, it will spread like wildfire on YouTube. It'll spread like wildfire on Facebook because they can't control that. Well, so much for that idea. That absolutely has been and is controlled. Social media is very carefully curated, as they love to put. That's their favorite word for that. So social media is no panacea any longer. And then the thing where I miscalculated, and this really became clear since 2017, is I would have to say I believed that if the public were presented with a statement by the establishment to the effect that UFOs are real, that this would likely trigger some kind of avalanche of an energized public that would say, hey, wait, you've been lying about this for so many years. We want to know everything about this. And by the way, what else have you been lying about? This was definitely how I thought the public reaction would be. And in fact, it hasn't turned out to be the case. I was dead wrong on this, because what we've seen in 2017 is that the national security apparatus is very, very astute at managing its process of disclosure, or managing any kind of undesirable leaks. So I look at the creation of ATIP and the Tic Tac UFO as undesirable leaks on their part. I don't think the national security apparatus wanted that information out. But once it came out, they're masters at managing the public perceptions. And so what's happened? There's kind of this tacit acknowledgement that UFOs are real, but they've done it genius level, by which they're not stating UFOs are real. They're like kind of sitting back and saying, yeah, it looks like there's something there. And where's the public on this? Where is the public? As Elizondo said in the early days, it sounds nothing. I hear nothing but crickets. Yeah. And that's what it is. The public is not energized by this. The public doesn't seem to give a damn, frankly. They're going about with their lives, and they don't care, because the fact is that there is no major media that is taking this narrative and pushing it. Maybe the only one in America might be occasionally Tucker Carlson over at Fox. He is literally the only major media voice that seems to care about this subject. I cannot identify any others. And so, people, unfortunately, are very passive. They eat the food that's been pre-chewed and served to them by the national security apparatus. And so there's not a lot of curiosity about it, or there's not a lot of knowledge, and there doesn't seem to be much of a push. So that's where I think I would say I miscalculated in 80 After Disclosure. It wasn't just me. I mean, I think Bryce, and I think probably if you had asked any other UFO researcher back in 2010, if the government were to give an acknowledgement that UFOs are real, I think we all would have said, wow, that would be an amazing thing. That would be such a shock. And yet they've actually managed it exceedingly well. One phrase that I used to repeat all the time that I coined was disclosure is impossible and inevitable. I always put it out as a paradox. It's impossible because there's no motivation for the powers that be to promote it. And that is still absolutely true. And I always said, but it's inevitable nonetheless, for the reasons that I kind of outlined a little earlier. I don't know if it's inevitable. I'm not so sure it's that if it's a done deal at all, which I used to think it would be. I would say it is possible, but it is also possible that a genuine disclosure could be withheld from us for a very long time. I mean, so long that it makes the subject irrelevant. That's possible.
Right. Interesting. Well, I mean, kind of staying, I guess, in that same vein, Congress got involved with this topic for the first time since, the Gerald Ford days, when we had semi-congressional hearings on this topic. And it was, it was depressing. It was sobering when those congressional hearings happened. I think a lot of people expected, they'd pull out the alien and bring it on the Congress floor, and that clearly did not happen. But yeah. Well, before I actually move on to the question asked, what did you make of the congressional hearing, Rich, on a personal level? Did that help hurt the topic, the subject? Did it hurt the government? Did it hurt the public?
I will say it was almost exactly what I was expecting. I just hate to say that. You're talking about the one that was almost a year ago. So from May of 2022. Yeah. So that's with Ronald Moultrie and Scott Bray when they spoke to Congress. The open part is what we saw, and that was, I think, about an hour. Wasn't that very long. Obviously neither of those men know much of anything about the UFO subject. It was quite obvious that they were both out of their depth. Moultrie was funny because he sounded almost exactly like John Samford from 1952 at the famous press conference in D.C. Moultrie's saying, well, yeah, there's objects out there, but we are confident, he said, that with enough information we can identify and mitigate all of them. That was the word that I loved, mitigate. And I watched that. And I'm like, dude, you're not mitigating anything here. You haven't mitigated this for 80 years. You're not going to mitigate it now. That's just a lot of brave talk there. But I suppose what I would say is that the one interesting thing that came out of it were some of the questions by Representative Mike Gallagher, who did bring up the Davis-Wilson memo. I thought, hey, okay, that's a nice little win. Got that in there. And I think it was, he asked a question about the UFOs and nukes, which, okay, good. Let's bring some of these things up. But really, there was, I would say, little to nothing of genuine substance that came out of it. And very little in terms of a promise for further information. I mean, they're just going through the motions here. So it was if there was someone who was actually waiting for a kind of disclosure moment, I think they would have been very disappointed, obviously. And for me, I'm at the George Carlin phase of life. 30 years ago, George Carlin's in his last stand-up phase, and he's like, look, I didn't vote for these guys. I'm just here to watch the shit show. I got a front row seat. And he'd like, I'm loving it. I used to listen to that years ago, and I'm like, wow, he's funny, but he's a little harsh. I look at it now, and I think, not harsh enough. So how did I get to the point where I'm channeling this ghost, the shade of George Carlin? But I definitely see where he's coming from. So my attitude is I don't expect, I'm just not expecting anything to come out of these congressional initiatives. I'm not saying things are impossible, and I'm not saying nothing will come out, but a genuine recognition, disclosure. Look, I know that there are some efforts behind the scenes toward this, and I have spoken to some people who have connections with that, who are like, no, we're making this happen. This is going to happen. So my attitude is good. If you make it happen, wonderful. I think you have more confidence in that system than I do. But I can't pretend that I have the full answer. All I have is my perspective. And looking at years of historical obfuscation. And also, understanding what the stakes are for these people. That is, giving up a genuine admission on this. I don't see how they win, because there's a lot to be lost. The only way that I could see them doing it is if they are pushed, as I said before, to the wall, and there's something even worse that will happen if they don't give up some of the truth, a sliver of the truth, which is all that we can ever expect, by the way. In other words, you think of UFO information as a mountain, and the people who have control over the information, if they give up something, if they give up anything, they're going to give up a sliver of that mountain, just a sliver. And it'll be the sliver that puts them in the best possible light. So, but even giving up a sliver is a dangerous game, because if you whet the appetite of the public on this too much, and you give the public the opportunity to ask difficult questions, then that's no good either. Government says, yeah, we actually have known about this for a little while, or this appears to be real. People are going to be like, really? So what does it say about crash retrievals? Is this a question that'll come up at a press conference? Have there been crash retrievals? And is anyone going to believe the denials? Maybe that will happen, and there will be denials, and maybe no one will believe them. But even if that's the case, will anything come out of that? Who believes that we have a functioning democratic system here? I mean, let's get real. Does anyone actually believe that the United States, or for that matter, the European system, you're in Scotland there, does anyone actually believe that anywhere in any society, Western society or anywhere, that governments at this point are amenable to the will of the people? In my view, the last 2+ years, they've just taken the mask off, and they're like, we don't give a crap. And what are you going to do about it? Yeah. Look what Trudeau did to the Canadian truckers a little over a year ago, which I think was a reprehensible crime by the Canadian government against their people. They don't care. They don't care. They don't care. You look at the EU leadership. None of them care. Every one of them are hated by the public, and they don't care because they know they don't need to care. So, and it's the same with the United States. So we're in a different situation than we were a couple of generations ago, where there was at least the pretense of public officials that actually were supposed to care about public opinion and would answer it. That's not the case anymore.
Yeah. It's the same everywhere. I hate to say it. Well, okay. You mentioned a buzzword in there, Rich. So I'm going to fast forward to our most popular question. Literally dozens and dozens of people wanted to get your most updated thoughts on this. You mentioned Wilson Davis.
Yes.
Where are you on this? I mean, this is probably one of the most contentious things to come out of ufology in a while. If you believe it, people want to wring your neck. If you don't believe it, people want to wring your neck too. Are we any closer to finding out? Is any of this real? Did it happen? I mean, it happened. I think everyone can sort of agree on that. The meeting happened. But what are your thoughts and perspectives on this?
Yeah.
The Somewhere in the Skies podcast is free to listen to every week, but if you would like to help support the show, we have a very active Patreon page where you give what you think the show is worth. In return, you'll get early access to the main show, bonus episodes, and priority to ask our guests your listener questions. Your support truly makes the show continue and grow. So, to learn more and to join, visit patreon.com/somewhereskies.
I think a few months ago I did a YouTube program which I called No More Excuses. That's what it was. And it was all about the Wilson Davis or Davis-Wilson notes. And essentially I said, there are no more excuses for people to be wavering on this and to doubt the authenticity of this document written by Dr. Eric Davis. You've had many people now have confirmed its authenticity, not just me. You know, I've been on the record since they came out in 2019. I said, look, I was shown several pages of those notes in 2006. And in fact, I went on the public record a number of times back then discussing. The one thing I didn't say back in 07, 08, and 09 was that I had seen the notes. And the only reason I didn't say that it was out of respect to the man who showed me those notes. This is a man I've never given up his name. And while he's alive, I won't, but because he doesn't want me to. But I'll just say he is extremely close to the situation. So he showed me these notes in 06. I started talking about Thomas Wilson in 2007. I talked about Thomas Wilson being denied access to a reverse engineering program in 2007 and 2008 and 2009. How the hell am I going to get that information if it didn't come from those notes? Obviously, I was shown those notes. And in fact, in one interview back in 07 with the Paracast hosted by Gene Steinberg, it was on July 1st of 2007. On that podcast, which can be found online, I actually very coyly quoted the notes themselves. I didn't say that, but I said, in context with Wilson, I said, yeah, he learned that there was technology not made by man, not by human hands. I said it on the podcast because I had read those words in 2006. So the notes have existed for all this time. And the person who showed me those notes, as I said, was very, very, very intimately close to that entire circle. This is obvious that Eric Davis was set on a mission by the Bigelow team, the NIDS people, essentially, to meet with Thomas Wilson, who had just gone into retirement in 2003 out of the Joint Chiefs, or 2002, excuse me. Those two? Yeah. And met with him and took detailed notes. Those are Davis's notes. That's his style. And who else has confirmed it? Well, Leslie Kane has confirmed that she'd known about the notes. And I can say this now. I mean, when those notes came out and I went public about this, defending them, Leslie wrote to me privately. She said, I'm so glad you're doing that. She said, unfortunately, I can't right now. It's a little too sensitive for me. And I'm like, okay, well, great. But she did publicly confirm them in 2022, as did Jacques Vallée, as have, I think, George Knapp also. They all have. All these people are intimately close to the situation. Davis can't do it. He can't. And Wilson can't. Obviously not. I was kind of amazed at people like Billy Cox, journalist, and how, he's done good work, but how dense can you be? Because Wilson denies it to take that denial at face value? Really? Is that what you call journalism? Obviously they can't admit to this because it's way too sensitive. But there is literally no excuse anymore for someone to say, gee, I don't think they're legit. I think it's a hoax. Like, let's get real. Let's just get real. And the information in those notes is too explicit. And it's, frankly, there's a tremendous amount of very valuable information for researchers who are interested in trying to understand the structure of UFO secrecy, at least the Pentagon's component of it. There are probably other government components. You probably got the DOE, and you've got the CIA, both of which I have been told have similar black budget SAP structures within those organizations that are equally impervious to outside review. But within the Pentagon, we know it's under the OUSTAT office, the Office of the Undersecretary for Acquisitions and Scientific Technology. And within that, they have other departments that are departments within departments that within those, you've got these special access programs that Thomas Wilson was able to find on the tips, by the way, given him by Stephen Greer in April 1997. Really? It's a crazy story, but I knew all about this when it happened. In fact, I talked about when I did the one ambush interview probably of my life when I called Thomas Wilson at the end of 2006. I called Wilson, and he got very upset and hung up the phone on me. So no, there is no more excuse. The document's real, and the thing we really need to be talking about is not, is it real? It's like, let's please get past that, because it's just cringe-worthy when people do this. But what we need to do is analyze the document and understand the implications. The implication of that document is the important thing, which is that you have, first of all, Wilson's being told. Now, you could say, I assume these were Lockheed guys, but whoever told him, were they telling him the truth? So the truth, presumably Wilson's sitting down with the gatekeepers of the program, who he identified as the security manager, the corporate attorney, and the program manager. And, what he said was that they told him, we have an intact craft and we're trying to figure it out. And we're really kind of outmatched by this thing. And we haven't made much progress, painfully slow progress, that type of thing. The real question to ask is, were they telling him the truth? That is the question. Yeah. The other part you can ask is, was Wilson telling Davis the full truth? Now, I think that question, the answer is probably yes. I don't think we can assume he told him the full truth. In fact, I'm pretty certain he did not tell Davis everything, but he told Davis a lot. And the reason is in the notes themselves. Wilson checked into Davis's bona fides. Wilson was very, very careful. He was very nervous about talking to anyone, but he trusted Davis because of the bona fides that had been given about Eric Davis. And so I think it's safe to say that Wilson was truthful for the most part with Davis. He may have held some things back. The real question to ask is, let's say the Lockheed guys, were they truthful to Thomas Wilson when they gave him their briefing? And that's a fair question to ask. And it could be that they were or were not truthful to him, or they were partly truthful. I think that they were truthful insofar as there was an ET UFO program. And I believe this because that is the entire reason Wilson looked for them. He found them. He was working off of a lead that Greer had given him, specifically about ET reverse engineering tech that was being worked at privately away from the auspices of U.S. Pentagon control. And so Wilson had this information. He found not one, but 4, actually, such programs, and only met with the managers of this one, who then said, yeah, this is ET. Wilson was funny when he's talking to Davis in those notes, because he's giving this pretense of asking them, well, is this Russian? Is this some adversary? I'm thinking when I read these notes, I don't think you believe that for an instant, Wilson. But I think he was just saying that to follow the old CYA rule. You got to cover line up your ducks and be careful. And I think that was the only reason. I think he knew full well what this was about. And to that extent, I think that they told him the truth, that there was a program. They did show him what was called the Big Ot list. That's simply the list of the people who are in the program. Wilson said it was between 400 and 800 names, and that they were almost all corporate, private, only a small handful of DoD personnel were part of this. It was all private contractor. I see no reason to doubt that at all. And the only thing you can ask that you might doubt is the question of painfully slow progress. That is the question. And I don't know the answer to that. It could be that they were telling him the truth. It could be that they were just blowing smoke up his behind because they wanted to get him off their back. Mm-hmm. Who really knows? I think the attitude would be, we can assume they told him as much as they felt they had to, and they did have to tell him something. This is the other thing we have to realize. Wilson found them and really pissed them off. And what we learned in those notes is that that group had nearly been outed a few years earlier by a Pentagon audit that found them. And what they said to Wilson was, yeah, we were nearly outed and we had to bring that auditor into the security to shut him up. That was the only solution we had. So, would you have a guy like Wilson who's blustering in there, trying to throw his weight around and saying, it's your mistake that you did not have me in as oversight over your group? Their attitude had to be, let's just think logically here. Their attitude was, all right, we don't have to let him in, but we do have to deal with him. He is vice chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff of Intelligence. He's not a nobody that we can just kick around like a little puppy dog. We have to respect him enough and deal with him. So the answer, I think, was exactly the right one from their point of view. They gave him a little bit of information and basically said, now go away. And Wilson said, this is not right. I need to be in here. I'm going to talk to my superiors. And their answer was, oh, go ahead if you want to talk to your boss. They clearly were not frightened. Wilson goes back to D.C., does complain, and what happens? He's threatened with his career. So I think that's what happened. These are important implications. Let's just stop and think. We are so used to the creeping fascism, essentially, that has just spread over the Western world. It's like we've given up on the idea of expecting our government to be responsive to us. It's like, yeah, we know they're corrupt. Well, you know what? Maybe we shouldn't be so complacent. This is a very important thing. I don't agree with Stephen Greer on everything. Let me just say that. But I agree with him 100% on his attitude back then, which was that this must not be a program that is dominated by private contractors who do not have sufficient government oversight, who get what they want because when the proper government liaisons retire, they get brought into the program and they make a lot of money as gatekeepers themselves, which is how the whole system works. It's utterly corrupt. And that's not a good system. And Greer was right for critiquing it back then. He was right to bring this to Wilson's attention back then. And, but it's just like we're in a world where people, are they willfully incapable of looking at the implications here? Some of them are, and some I just don't think they pay attention enough to understand the stakes that are involved in, when you look at everything involved in the Wilson Davis notes. We are talking, as I stand by what I called it a few years ago, the UFO leak of the century, which it remains to this day. It is the UFO leak of the century.
Yeah. Unfolding story. We need to find at least one of those 400 to 500 people, like you mentioned, who may have worked in this program. That, like you said, leaks are the only, and they're a natural process of any government, in terms of like how we get any transparency. Seems to be when they're backed into a corner and leaks happen. If there were any leaks to happen, I personally hope it's on a crash retrieval program. With all the research I've done the past 20 something years of my life, that for me would be it. Not of blurry video from the Navy, not even any photo or video. It's the admittance of some sort of program, and that we actually have a craft of unknown origin in our possession in any country, not just in the United States too. So if this is it, if this truly is the leak of the century, it would change everything. It honestly would. And I don't know where I stand on the Wilson Davis thing, to be upfront, but hearing you talk about the implication is enough to be like, we need to keep looking at this, in my opinion.
Well, let me just say this. So back in 2006, when I was preparing to phone Thomas Wilson, I was in touch with the man who showed me the notes to begin with. He's famous. He's a great guy. I like him. I was writing to him and I said, well, I am going to contact Wilson about this. And his attitude was, well, good luck with that. And after I called Wilson, I wrote back and I said, yeah, Wilson just denied everything. And this guy said, well, what do you expect? Everything is on the line with him, which I knew as well. Like, obviously, I knew all of this going into it. Like, if Wilson were to give an acknowledgement to me on the phone, he knew that I would publicize that. And it's like, a little house of cards or a little house of toothpicks coming crashing down all at once. It would be a huge admission coming from a very important person back in 06, 07 of the existence of a UFO program. I mean, you just remember where we were back then. There was no admission from the government about anything like this whatsoever. Yeah. And no, I mean, it would blow all of his security clearances for the rest of all time, first of all, right? And it would also be a real explosive danger to UFO secrecy in general. And there would be no way that he could. But I figured, look, I learned Wilson's name. I knew all about this. And I thought, I'm just going to give a guy a phone call and see what happens. And so I mean, I guess what I'm saying is it was very clearly understood between myself and the individual who had shown me the notes to begin with, what the implications were. This is heavy duty stuff. And no, it's not an official government document, but it doesn't matter. You're talking about a senior government official, senior government defense official, acknowledging the reality of this phenomenon and how he got shut out of it by essentially a corporation. How are the implications of that not profound? So it's been very obvious all this time that this is a very serious matter. And the last thing I'll say here is I think those individuals who went on the record to try to throw cold water on this, to try to debunk it, and I think did a real disservice, a true disservice to ufology. It was the biggest disappointment to me professionally to see some colleagues of mine go out of their way, it seems, to debunk this critically important leak and really hinder our ability as a community to move forward with this, to have an opportunity to get this into a broader conversation publicly. And it didn't happen because a number of key people very prominently and really, I think, with some of them with malintent, went out of their way to debunk this publicly. It was a real misfortune for ufology.
Yeah. Well, hey, if it's of any consolation, the book's still open for me, and I closed it. I was one of those people, Rich. I never spoke publicly or privately to you about it, but I kind of was like, I don't know. But the more I hear you talk about it, the more it sounds like this is a authentic occurrence, and this was an actual program, and he is 100% genuine in what he was told. Like you said, the big question is, who told him this, and was that true?
There's every reason to wonder about the truth of what Wilson was told.
Yeah,
there's every reason to wonder. But you have to, even if we go down that road, we have to ask, okay, is 100% of what they told him false? Is 50% of what they told him false? Is 0% of what they told him false, or some other number in there? We have to ask that. I think 100% is highly unrealistic. I think even 50% is unrealistic. Yeah. Frankly, to tell someone who is essentially running intelligence for the Joint Chiefs, like, you're going to really lie that much to this guy? You're really going to make up a story and give him a big BS tell? Really? Even if you're a contractor with highest level security, you're just going to lie flat out. You got cojones that big? You're going to lie flat out to this guy who does have some power? No, I think what you will do is you will tell him as much as you need to tell him. You might hedge a little bit here and there. That's possible. But to assume that they lied to him, I think, is also not realistic. Not realistic. So that's where I stand on it. And I can definitely tell you that Eric Davis wrote those notes. Everyone close to Davis knows this and has privately said so, by the way. Okay? They may not all go on the record, but they all know this. So Davis wrote the notes. And people who know Davis know he is fanatically, like, I've heard people say he is incapable of lying. Well, I don't know if that's actually true. Is anyone truly incapable? But we get the idea. Davis is scrupulously, openly honest about, and you listen to the guy. You know, he essentially said this as much. There was a now a censored interview that he did with Stephen Greenstreet of the Basement Office, where Greenstreet asked him flat out, and Davis talked about those notes as from Edgar Mitchell's estate, which they were. They were from Ed Mitchell's estate, and of course he never denied it. He spoke of them as totally real, and they all know it's real. But these people are all afraid of losing security clearances. That's number one. This isn't a classified document, but it does not matter. It's a document that deals with very classified goings on within the national security structure, and all of those people, whether you're talking about Davis or Puthoff or Kit Green or Colm Kelleher or any of the other people associated, with that crowd, they've all had long-standing security clearances, and they're not willing to lose that by having loose lips on this matter and saying, "Oh yeah, it's real." They've got the fig leaf still covering them just enough where they can say, "No, I didn't say anything."
Yeah,
and that's where they're leaving it, because they're all about preserving their access, because all of those people are on a quest. The quest is to get to the center of the labyrinth. All of them. None of them are at the exact center. Not maybe Davis. I don't know, but I doubt it. I don't think they're where they want to be. They all want more information. And back 20 years ago, I know this for a fact, all of those people wanted to get more information than what they had. And so when Wilson finally retired, because they knew about this right from the beginning, in 97, Mitchell was part of the Greer team to meet with Wilson, Edgar Mitchell. And Mitchell was part of the whole NIDS crowd. He was friends with Davis and Puthoff and Green and Bigelow and Colm Kelleher and John Alexander. Like, all of these people worked together on the National Institute of Discovery Science. So Mitchell learned about Wilson being shut out of his meeting with the contractors through Navy Commander Will Miller. So Willard Miller, he was with them. He was the one who found from Wilson that Wilson got locked out in June of 97, 3 months later. And he tells Greer and he tells Mitchell, because they were all together. Greer goes on all through the subsequent years. Greer openly talked about this. In fact, in his book, Hidden Truth, Forbidden Knowledge, in 2006, he mentioned the meeting. He mentioned Wilson, talked about it. And Mitchell also learned about it, and he told his entire crew at NIDS. One of those people said to me, "Oh yeah, I've known about that document since day 2." All right, they've all known. All right, so they're all interested in getting to the center of the secret. They coveted that. And it's possible in the interim years that some of them may have gotten there. It's possible. But in 2002, when they sent Davis on his mission, and Davis basically had a home run interview with that, when they sent him off, that was their goal. They wanted information. They wanted confirmation from Wilson. And they got it. And it was only supposed to be for themselves. This wasn't for the rest of the world. They weren't interested in publicizing this anywhere. So that's the meeting. That's how it worked. That's why it matters. That's why it's true.
All right.
There.
Keep
done.
looking into it, guys. Yeah. I'm back in. You pulled me back in. I love it.
I kept trying to come out, and they pull me back in.
Every damn time, Rich. Last 2 questions for you before we move over to Patreon, if that's all right with you. Okay, cool. You've been gracious with your time.
Happy to do it.
This is thank you. A academic question, actually. Eamon, through email, asks, "I'm an academic and I'm considering formulating a degree-level course on the phenomenon. What areas would Rich want to include in the modules that would make up such a course? I mean, we are hearing more and more these days of universities taking this topic seriously, whether from a historical aspect or sociological, everything. Yeah. But yeah, what would you do if you had that?
I actually already did this. I wrote a book called UFOs for the 21st Century Mind. That is explicitly, I'm serious, this is explicitly the answer to that individual's question. I designed this. Actually, originally, I was asked by what was then an online university of sorts. What do they call themselves? The International Metaphysical University. I don't even know if they're around. Back in, I forget what year, 2011 or thereabouts, they said, hey, we would like for you to teach a course on UFOs, like a UFOs 101 type thing. They'd originally asked Stanton Friedman, but I guess Stan didn't want to do it. And they asked me, and I thought, I'll design something. And I wrote what really became UFOs for the 21st Century Mind. And what I looked at were, I will just say, I looked at the first chapter is what are UFOs? So I asked a series of philosophical questions, scientific questions. How do we understand what even a UFO is? How are UFOs easily misidentified, and so on and on. And then I talk about in that chapter, the implications of what UFOs might mean to society. I have a chapter talking about theories of ancient visitation, the whole ancient aliens phenomenon. And I try to dip my toe into that and get into it. And then there are several chapters that deal with I think a proper, concise analysis of the history of the UFO phenomenon from early modern times to the present. I get into the political implications, which are very important for any kind of academic understanding of this. You want to understand, how does the cover-up work? What are the politics of the UFO phenomenon? You need to understand that. And so I try to do that both at the surface level and then at the deeper level, what I call the breakaway civilization level. And then the other things I deal with are contact and abduction, the whole where the rubber meets the road. It's like what is actually happening here when you have individuals who allege that they have had direct encounters with alien beings. How do we make sense out of this? And, I try to deal with that. Another thing that academicians need to understand, and I haven't seen anyone in the academic world or in the world of ufology deal with this other than myself, which is to track the growth of ufology against the backdrop of our changing society in general, including the birth of the internet, including just cultural and social changes and the back and forth interaction that ufology has had with our society at large, and how UFO research has evolved over the years. Like, these are important things. And I don't really hear anything from anywhere else about that. And then I have one chapter on the science of UFOs, which is, weird science, whether it's propulsion technology or space-time or consciousness itself. That is the science of the UFO phenomenon is extremely important to understand. And then the other things is just looking at them and looking at our future. Who are they? What do they want? I don't know if you can study this academically precisely, but I think you can get into things like comparative psychology, evolutionary psychology. You can start asking, what might these other beings be interested in terms of their reasons for coming here? Is there a reason that they might be here? Well, I have a lot of thoughts on that. And then the final chapter of that book is attempt to look into the future. Where are we going? What is our trajectory? What is the trajectory of this phenomenon within the context of our civilization? So that book literally is the textbook. That was explicitly my intention. So to the individual who wrote that question, I would just say, hey, go buy the new and expanded edition of UFOs for the 21st Century Mind. And I think it will give you a very good foundation for further academic analysis of this subject. That was my intention.
Yeah, required reading. There you go. These were the questions that kind of really, I think, are going to stretch our muscles when it comes to theory and aliens and UFOs. A lot of government talk, but this is the fun stuff, I think, where we can really have some cool conversations. So question here is from Ariel, and she asked this over on Twitter. How much of the phenomenon do you think is physical nuts and bolts, and how much is interdimensional? Is this something you tackled in your book?
Yeah, I think about this a lot. I would say I do not think that those are exclusive answers. Yeah. So I think, in other words, something can be if we know how to understand what interdimensional is, first of all, that's a question of itself, but that doesn't preclude them being physical. So if you think of something like the Skinwalker Ranch, where there are, there's some allegations of a portal type of activity, for example, out of the Skinwalker. Does that mean these objects, these beings are not physical when they are here in our reality? When you have I'm thinking of Skinwalker once again, when you have one of the animal mutilations that occur that seem to happen like so rapidly within the space of minutes, where you don't understand, does that mean that it's not a physical event? Like, it is a physical event. There's something physical happening. So I think I would say these are definitely physical manifestations. At least most of the time they appear to be to me. But that doesn't preclude that they have a way of manipulating space and time in ways that we don't quite understand, that might make them seem interdimensional. That might be actually part of the answer. In other words, there are telepathic elements to this phenomenon. Does that preclude that they're physical, or could there be a technology that's involved in the telepathy? Or could you have telepathy from a purely biological standpoint? Is that possible? I think the answer is yes, you probably could. So that's not mutually exclusive. When you have objects that are sometimes described as entering out of nothingness, what does that mean? I was chatting with some local folks about the UFO subject last night. We have a local UFO meetup in Rochester, and someone described a craft that seemed to come out of a slit in the sky. So what does that mean? Does it mean that they came in from another dimension? It could. Or does it mean that they're just using some kind of cloaking technology, that we actually are developing that now in our military? So there's a lot of things that we still don't know in terms of, is this interdimensional, or is this extraterrestrial, or what? And I'll just furthermore say that I don't really think most of us, certainly include myself, but I think most of us do not, when we talk about interdimensional, I'm not sure we really understand what that means.
Right.
Which is, it's fair. It's fair not to understand, because our brains only go to a certain level. Like, we're very intelligent creatures, but we're not infinitely intelligent. There are things that have to do with the nature and fabric of reality that we probably just don't get. It's like, do you expect your dog to know where you drive when you go to work, when you leave the house in the morning? Your dog has no idea, because it's a dog. They're wonderful, smart creatures, but there are things that they don't know. It's the same with us. There are things that we probably structurally in our brains, we lack the ability to know certain elements of this reality, and we may forever not be able to know. So I'm not really sure. It's something that I try to be careful about. But I do think that additional dimensions is a real possibility with this. And in fact, it's likely. It's likely that we're not really understanding something very, very big about this whole reality that we find ourselves in. And it's very possible that these beings are able to navigate through these elements of reality in a way that we can't. But does that mean they're not physical? I wouldn't go that far. I think that I would say, yes, of course they are physical. The question is, what is the nature of the physics that they partake in? There's a physical nature to them. And the question that I want to ask is, what is that physical nature? That's what I would say.
I love that. Yeah, really good point. That actually kind of bleeds in to our next question here. This comes from YouTube. Joseph on YouTube asks, do the changes in UFO UAP experience over the last 75 plus years match cultural changes in the world? Or are they a progression of experiences from advancing alien tech or an agenda? Little two-pronged question there.
Yeah, that's an outstanding question. It really, in a lot of ways, gets to the heart of, I guess, what you can call the psychosocial interpretation of the UFO subject. And it's a really good argument. So let's just be real about it. You have a transformation, even from prior to the 1950s and 40s. I mean, there was sci-fi back in the 30s and 20s. There's Buck Rogers, and before that you had H.G. Wells. I mean, we always had ideas about men from Mars or from other planets and what aliens would be like. And it's an absolutely critical question to ask. How have those cultural expectations influenced our interpretation of the UFO subject? And in fact, is the UFO subject nothing other than a kind of cultural fantasy based on our interest in sci-fi. Is that possible? There are people who say, yes, that's what it is. That's all that it is. There are people who've got, they misinterpret unusual atmospheric things and they assume, oh, it's aliens. Or there are people who have a mental derangement of some sort or another and they think that they've had an alien abduction. Like that's the explanation that some of these people would have, that this phenomenon is interpreted through a cultural lens. Now, I would have to say in some measure, this is true. We do interpret the UFO phenomenon through a cultural lens. We can't help it.
Yeah.
That's absolutely the case. When you look at, old photographs, like the George Adamski photographs of UFOs, I mean, a lot of people will say, well, those are fake photographs, and they could be fake. But they don't look some of them don't look particularly sleek the way that we would think. So what's up with this? Well, a couple of things are possible here. So one thing is, I guess that I would say I am quite satisfied that there is a genuine UFO phenomenon. And I am satisfied for that because I've simply read too many hundreds of declassified U.S. military encounters with UFOs. Too many. And also from other nations as well. And those objects typically have been described as disc-shaped in military documents. And that in those documents, these guys are not playing games. They have to tell the truth. They're reporting these things accurately as accurately as they can. And you have an absolute pattern of saucer-shaped objects that have been reported again and again and again and again. So I think that is a consistent element. What you do see is a variety of shapes and descriptions of these objects. What causes that? Well, one thing that might cause it is the fact that they may have different groups that have different variations of how they build the craft. That is entirely possible. And it's also possible that they have gone through redesigns of their craft based on human society's increasing capabilities over the last 70, 80 years. We're vastly more sophisticated electronically in many other ways of detection than we were in the 1940s and 50s. So it's possible that they too have gone through their evolution and upgrading their, you may think, well, why would they? They're so far ahead of us. But I don't know. I don't know where they are. They could very well be adapting to changes in our society. In terms of alien encounters, this sometimes is tricky. You have descriptions in the 1950s of small aliens, sometimes wearing spacesuits, sometimes described as small aliens without spacesuits but big heads, but not the big black wraparound eyes. Why not? I don't know why not. Why are they not described as big wraparound black eyes in the 1950s, but then they are in the 1970s and 80s and beyond? Mm-hmm. Why are some of the beings described by leaks to people like Leonard Stringfield from the 1970s and 60s? Why are those beings described as short gray aliens, but without the black wraparound eyes? They have everything that you get with gray aliens except those, basically. Mm-hmm. Why do we not get the big black eyes until the late 1970s? This is a cultural thing. And I wonder about this. I don't know, but it's possible that there are reasons that I just can't think of. Maybe there's variations in grays. Maybe these beings are genetically modified and enhanced. Maybe the black element of their eyes are lenses that can be removed. There's a couple of different things. So I guess it's a good question. Certainly our understanding of the UFO phenomenon has gone through a lot of changes since the 1950s. A lot of changes. We're not thinking of, men from another planet, from Mars, men from Mars coming to Earth. All right, so we're a little bit past that. But I suspect that what's happened is that this phenomenon has been so far out ahead of us that it has taken us a very long time culturally to kind of catch up and to get to a point where we are even able to begin to appreciate just how strange it probably is. That's a possibility. So I don't know if I really fully answered that question, but I did my best just there. So hope that's okay.
Yeah. No, I appreciate it. Well, and you ask a lot of these theoretical questions in your book, Alien Agendas. And I think that the person who asked that should definitely check that book out, because you do broach a lot of that in there as well.
Thank you. There are different alien types that I try to list in that book. And I only dealt with a few of the alien types in that book. I mean, if you really wanted to get into throwing in the kitchen sink, there's a lot of variety that's been described. And I discuss it a little bit. I focus in on the human-looking ones, and then the different types of grays, and then you get some of the insectoid, mantid-type descriptions, and some of the reptilian types. And I try to treat those. And in that book, I did try to kind of hypothesize and try to make some sense out of it, purely from a theoretical point of view.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, this is theoretical too, Rich, in terms of not the beings themselves, but our ability to possibly make contact with them. Joe on YouTube asks, does Richard think it may be possible to directly interact with intelligent beings, whether through consciousness, altered states? This big CE5 thing is a huge movement that's been going on the past decade or so, I'd say, maybe longer. It's pretty big. You hear a lot of celebrities get involved with it, and musicians and stuff like that. And I get asked every day, like, have you ever tried it? And no, I personally haven't, so I can't really speak on it. I'm almost afraid to be completely honest, from a personal level. But yeah, do you think it's possible that we can communicate with these intelligences?
Yeah, I do. I think it's definitely possible. And I think some of the CE5 initiatives have probably done that. Although I'm going to emphasize, I think some of them are totally fraudulent and fake. But I think some have been real. Excuse me. I've spoken to, I actually attended a couple of CE5s here in Rochester. We had some folks, friends of mine did, and I hung out for some of them, and nothing happened while I was there. I didn't detect anything that I thought was unusual at all. And by the way, no one else did when we were there. But that's not to say that some people don't. I will just say, you got to be careful, because there are a lot of known instances of so-called CE5s that are satellites. And I have recently come to understand that there are some definite, explicitly fraudulent CE5 events that have happened, and that's all I'm going to say about it. But I don't know if it's true, but I've heard it, and it seemed legit to me from that particular source. That doesn't mean that they all are, but I think some of them, you got to be careful. But having said that, I think that my personal pet theory is that human consciousness is just at the cusp of what we can call genuine significant psi ability. Look, I'm married to a remote viewer who is really good at remote viewing. I'm not saying she's the greatest remote viewer in the world, but she's a good remote viewer. And I've met many other remote viewers, and I don't need to be convinced of the reality of psychic capabilities in human beings. And when you ask yourself, like, what does that mean? What does that say about the nature of reality? What does that say about the nature of human beings? Like, it really does cause you to think very carefully about all of those things. What I would say is, we human beings have achieved some level of psi ability. And this is through natural evolution of the human brain. It's almost certainly the result of the brain complexity and size that we have achieved in our evolution as a species at this time. So whereas I can assume that earlier versions of human, like Homo erectus or earlier, may not have had those capabilities because their brains just weren't large enough. If that theory is true, then you could assume like larger brain beings, like the Greys, let's say, might have this capability even greater than we do. And so if that's the case, we have to ask, what is the nature of their reality? Do they have telepathic communication with each other? I think they may. And if you're a highly telepathic alien monitoring those humans on the ground there, on the surface, maybe you just might be interested in those humans who have that ability pitched a little higher. How many times have we heard the following anecdote from a person who would say, I started meditating 6 months ago, and just recently I had some kind of what I think is a contact experience with another intelligence. Yeah. I've heard this so many times. It's almost a cliche because it's so widespread. What does it mean? Well, I think it could very well mean what people think it means, which is that if you're a highly telepathic alien species looking at humans, who's going to interest you the most? Very likely those humans who have that ability that's closer to yours. You're going to find them interesting. And maybe you'll send them a message that they'll do a download of, as people might say. So I don't rule any of that out. I think that's entirely possible. I would say it's likely that some of that happens. So yes, I think that's a long-winded answer to your question. Can we communicate with them? I think we can. But the question is, how effective is that communication? How meaningful will it be? That's a whole other question. Are these other beings going to be ready to bring us into the Galactic Federation of Light because some of us have some psi abilities? Well, that's a whole other question. I tend to doubt that would be the case.
Hey, I know if it's any indication of the world today, I can understand why we haven't been invited to the table, for sure. Okay, last question here, Rich, over on Patreon. This comes from Marisol. She's actually been our longest Patreon subscriber since I started the show. So awesome. She was super excited to see you coming on here. And she's a big fan of your work on Ancient Aliens. So, of course, naturally, she wants to ask,
I'm not saying it's aliens, but it's aliens. No, I'm sorry.
What are your thoughts on Ancient Aliens? I mean, it's a simple question, but it's a loaded question. You know, in all of your research, is there evidence that this is a thing?
Yep, I think so. I said as much in the alien agendas, but I have a caveat. So I think the caveat is, first of all, I think a lot of evidence that is portrayed as ancient alien evidence is not good evidence for that. And this is not to knock the show. I mean, look, they do their best, but a lot of it is just entertainment, right?
Yeah,
nice production values. They're trying to have entertaining TV. I mean, hell, I knew the creator of Ancient Aliens. He was Kevin Burns. He passed away not long ago. And Kevin was a great guy, and he was a total sci-fi nerd. And his office is like old Lost in Space imagery and Planet of the Apes and Star Wars. And he was a complete sci-fi geek, and he loved this. For him, it was entertainment. It didn't mean that there wasn't something to it, but it's all about, this is fun, this is interesting. And that's what the show, I think, really tries to portray, with an emphasis on some serious issues. Yes, I won't deny that. But I think a lot of the evidence that is being portrayed as for Ancient Aliens is probably not legit. But having said that, I think that we have been very likely subject to a long-term monitoring process. Yes. But we have to keep in mind a few things. You go back 1,000 years, 2,000, 5,000, 10,000 years. All right. And ask yourself, what could an alien species have done with us? What could we have done with them? When you have human beings living in pre-urban hunting and gathering types of communities, could we have done a thing about an alien presence? Literally nothing. What would have been the point? So, and what could they have done with us except maybe take some of our DNA? Okay, fine. But it's not like we're going to have some kind of relationship with these other beings. How would that be possible? At the most, maybe they took some of us and bred us and created the human-looking aliens that we often encounter. That's entirely possible. So I think that there is reason to think that we've been subject to a long-term monitoring process. But I think things have been very, very different in the last century or more. And I say that, and I feel more and more as time goes by, I feel stronger about this. So I think that there's a distinctive difference in the UFO phenomenon in the last century, i.e., there has been an explosion of UFO activity. And it's not that there wasn't a lot of UFO activity in the past, but let me just ask you and listeners a question here. Think of a society like mid to late 19th century America or Europe. Okay. So those were societies that were scientific in their orientation. They were very sophisticated. You had very smart people in America of the 1870s and 1880s, right? Very observant, very like can-do about all kinds of things. And there was not any consciousness at all of UFOs or aliens. Why is that? No one was seeing them. There were a couple of unusual events in the skies that were noted. It's true. But there was no UFO phenomenon. There was no awareness of anything. Why? Were they just that oblivious? I don't think so. Those are very, very capable people. I think there was no consciousness and awareness of the UFO subject at that time because it just wasn't there in large numbers. But it began to be here in large numbers, certainly measurably by the 1940s. Now that makes sense. 1940s, you see human society going through a convulsion of the Second World War and a massive explosion of science and technology. The reason I am convinced that we are being seen, visited here in massive numbers today, and it is massive, is because of our own trajectory as a species, as a society. We are moving into what I call the fourth stage of humanity. This is a major epoch-changing transition. We've only had, in my view, 3 other stages of humanity before this. Stage 1, which went for hundreds of thousands, indeed millions of years, was hunting and gathering. Even before we looked like this, our hominin ancestors who stood upright, walked on 2 legs, hunted animals with big sharp spears, and they hunted and killed them, and they lived in a certain way for a long, 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 long time. Then, only 10,000 years ago, roughly, we start developing agriculture and domesticating livestock and animals. That's stage 2. That gives us settled human societies. That gives us the wheel. It gives us writing. It gives us metallurgy. It gives us, everything from ancient Sumerian society to Egypt to the Roman Empire to the Italian Renaissance. All of that is stage 2. It's agriculturally based humanity. And that gave us a good run. That was a great human society. But then comes stage 3, where we discover science, like serious science. Galileo and Descartes and Newton and Leibniz and all of these geniuses who reoriented human consciousness into a completely different way, which immediately on the heels of that, we have the Industrial Revolution. They go hand in hand. And scientific and industrial revolutions utterly transformed our world, and they gave us the world that we were born into. That's stage 3. But we're now moving into stage 4, and this is the stage, I believe, that any visiting intelligence is particularly interested in, because it's this stage that makes us like them. It's, well, what are some of the qualities of stage 4? Transhumanism, very strong AI, which we are now seeing in our society this year, really for the first time in a big way. You have other things like nanotech. You have advances in things like quantum computing. You have 5G and soon to be 6G, 24/7 surveillance of the entire human race, turning us into one big digital anthill. So it's completely transforming human social organization under one massive digital control. And it will completely transform human psychology and probably human physiology over the next coming century in a big way. So, and with the amount of data that we now have access to, we never had access to data like this before, nor the ability to kind of crunch it and analyze it ever. So this is a qualitative transformation of the human species on par with the development of agriculture 10,000 years ago. It's absolutely on par with that. So it's going to change our species and our civilization fundamentally. And so progress is not this linear thing. It advances by leaps and jumps. And we're in the midst right now of a major jump into something totally different. I'm not sure I like this jump, by the way, and I don't think that I want to be part of it, to be honest with you. But hey, what I think has no bearing on the outcome. It's happening. It's obviously happening, and no one knows how to stop it. It cannot be stopped. So we're going through this transformation, and we are leaping into their world, and they know this. Nuclear technology is only one part of that transformation. It's nukes, it's computers, it's AI, it's everything. You think of any of the disruptive technologies we're looking at today, and any one of them is world changing. And now just start putting all of them together and ask yourself, what is human society going to look like in 50 years or 100 years? It's not going to look like this. And these beings know this, and they are here for that reason, because these transformations are making humanity potentially tremendously powerful. And we're really wrong if we think, oh, we'll never be at their level. We got to disabuse ourselves of that very naive notion. We think, oh no, well, we could never achieve. They're eons ahead of us. Well, I don't think it works like that. Progress is not something that just goes forever and ever infinitely. It's impossible. There's no such thing. You can't just keep advancing and progressing forever. The world doesn't work like that. Nothing works like that. At a certain point, we're going to hit a plateau where I think most of them are already at. And I think we are about to reach the beginning stages of that plateau. We may have other plateaus to reach, entirely possible, but we're going to a big one right now. And over the next century, I think we're going to solidify our position at that plateau. And things may very well level out for a while. I think that's totally possible. But when they do, we're going to be a very formidable species. And I think these other beings realize this. And I think maybe they want to get control over us, or maybe they want to know, like, are these humans a problem, or whatever. They may have different attitudes about this. But certainly it is our transformation that is the key. They're here because of us. They're here because of where we are at on our unbelievable trajectory. Let's just stop and appreciate how dramatic the human transformation has been. We often take this stuff for granted, because, like, we're born, we're living in the 21st century, and we're like, oh yeah, smartphones, oh yeah, strong AI, like it's the norm. It's not the norm. This is brand new stuff, and it is utterly disruptive. And by the way, we have no idea how stable our society is. We've only had this stuff is all new. We're creating a completely new living environment for our entire species. You know, we used to live. It was hard, but like you had a relatively stable environment. Yes, you had climatic changes and all of that, but they didn't happen overnight. You could always kind of rely on your environment. It was always going to be there. You know, we were part of we're an integral part of an interconnected web of an ecosystem. Well, we've really kind of shot our ecosystem in a large way, and we've created this artificial ecosystem filled with digital stuff that, you know, I mean, I'm talking to you virtually here. You know, That's kind of weird. How stable is this? We don't know. In the grand scheme of things, this is all really, really new. So I think they're here because we're very interesting right now. Are we going to flame out like the greatest, flame out, or are we going to jump into where they are? For that reason, I think right now humanity is the greatest show in this part of the galactic quadrant. In another few centuries, maybe it'll be another species that'll be the greatest show. But right now it's us, because we are, as I say, we're about potentially to leap into their world. And that's what brings them here. So that was started out with the question on ancient aliens. So I suspect the big transformation for us that really got their attention, well, probably, our invention of fire might have been one, but then, other landmarks along the way, they're thinking, oh yeah, these standing up apes are pretty darn smart. Keep an eye on them. That type of thing. I wouldn't be surprised if they had the ability to do that back then. But it's, I think in the last 50,000 years, since we've really had complex language, that I think is the current assessment, could be a little longer, probably about 50,000 years, when we've actually had complex ability to really communicate, sophisticated ideas, I think was what really set us on a path from the point of no return. I think once that started, everything that we've achieved now is inevitable. Once you have the ability to manipulate information in terms of abstract language, it's almost like a done deal. It's like, when are you going to get to the point where you can now manipulate information, abstract data, where you are discovering scientific secrets and mathematics and all of that? And we figured it out. It took us about 50,000 years. which in the grand scheme of things may not be that long.
Good point. Could be a freaking speck on the larger scope. I get it. Wow, that's fascinating. Thank you for answering those for us, Rich. Well, of course. Last question, as always. Where can we find everything you're up to?
Yeah, I would encourage people to. I'm glad you've got Patreon supporters. I'm really glad. You deserve that. If they want to support me, if they find it in their hearts or their desires, they can go to Richard Dolan Members and become a member of my site. Or they can just go swing by and check out the free stuff. I have a lot of free material there, lots and lots. So you don't have to become a member. I have a YouTube channel. So my website is richarddolanmembers.com. My YouTube channel is just Richard Dolan Intelligent Disclosure, and I'm sure it's easy to search and find. I try to put fresh content up there every so often, like maybe every other week. I'm not as rigorous about it as some people. I'm not like a hardcore YouTuber, but I do have an active presence on YouTube, and I do try to keep that going.
Awesome. Yeah, go subscribe, guys. Well, that's all I got for you, Rich. Again, I got to thank you for your time. You gave me a chance early on in my endeavors in this field, and I will be forever grateful to you for
Ryan,
that, and it's a true honor.
Thank you. And you don't need to thank me. You deserve it. You are a great presence in this field, and I'm glad that we have you.
Thank you, brother. Appreciate it. Thank you so much.
The Somewhere in the Skies podcast is part of the LIONSGATE Sound Network. Please take a moment to rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever possible. Thank you for listening.